We think this gardening method is essential, especially if you're growing on a smaller piece of land. Guten Yardening, everybody! Well, this is the next video in our series where we talk about gardening methods that we think you should try this upcoming season, and I think this might be one of the most important for taking advantage of whatever space you have. And that's right, we're talking today about succession planting. I'm going to take a second here to define succession planting, or at least what it means to us, because it doesn't just have to mean growing 3 or 4 different crops in the same area. That's certainly one definition, but it could also be growing the same crop multiple times in one season. But a really important thing to note about succession planting is that you have one crop ready to go as soon as one finishes, so you can maximize that growing time. So in this video, we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know in order to be successful at succession planting. The first thing that we think is essential to know is your growing zone. Now, if you're outside the United States, you may not have the exact same language around growing zones, but what we're really talking about here is the approximate last frost date and first frost date for wherever it is that you're growing. Now, why is this so important to know? Because what we're talking about with succession planting is the amount of vegetables and the amount of different vegetables that you can grow in a space over the entirety of your growing season. And so if you don't know the length of your growing season, it's really hard to maximize that growing potential. Now, like anything that involves Mother Nature and weather, you're not going to necessarily have that perfect timing down just because you know your growing zone. And quite frankly, as weather patterns change, the last frost date and the first frost date may shift for you in your growing zone. But if you have an idea, a basic outline of when your growing season can start and when it's going to end, then that's going to help you better prepare for your entire planting schedule. And so what we recommend you do is to go online and you can put in your zip code and find out exactly what your growing zone is, and that should give you an idea of that last frost date and that first frost date. And that ties directly into the second thing you need to know for succession planting, and that is know which vegetables you like and how long they take to grow. This is one of the mistakes I think people make. They find a vegetable that they think looks interesting or that they're wanting to try, but they don't necessarily know how well it grows in their area, and they don't necessarily know how long it takes to grow. And so if I'm trying to take advantage of a small space and I want to make sure I can get 2 or 3 different crops in there, I'm going to have to make sure that I'm planting vegetables that can allow for that. Now, we're in Zone 5, Wisconsin, and we have a pretty short growing season. And so that means if I want to get multiple crops out of one area, well, I'm not going to be able to just put, say, sweet potatoes in that area, which take about 110 to 115 days, because that's going to take up most of my season. And so if I'm talking about succession planting, I need to know which vegetables are shorter growing vegetables, the ones that take 30 days or 35 days like our spinach or our radishes. I need to know which vegetables require a lot of warmth in the soil, and I need to know which ones are more cold hardy. If I'm starting a vegetable like a radish in the early spring, I know that or my peas or my spinach can handle the potential of some pretty cold weather. The same thing in the fall. But I'm not going to sit there and start in March in Zone 5 with my tomatoes. That's just not going to work. Now, if you know how long it takes a vegetable to grow to maturity and about how long it lasts, then you can do what we did with our squash this past season. We had some summer squash, and summer squash, typically the ones that we were growing, take about 60 to 65 days. So what we did with those squash was we knew that they were prone to the potential for powdery mildew and to vine borers, which we've dealt with over the past couple seasons. So once they were about halfway mature, we started some more, and we were able to, once they reached full maturity and actually stopped producing fruit because of, as we suspected, an attack from the vine borers. So by the time those were dead and ready to come out, we had some plants ready to go back in their place. And so we didn't have to deal with a ton of downtime or trying to get more squash started from seed. We didn't waste that growing season. Now, I just talked about containers as one place where we grow our vegetables, and that leads us to the third thing that you should know about succession planting, and that is know your space. And the reason I say that is because not every vegetable is going to fit into every space. Now believe me, when I say that we have experimented around with trying unique ways and unique spaces for growing vegetables, like our potatoes grown vertically in our green stalk vertical garden. We definitely experiment with that, but let's say we're talking about a grow bag or a smaller container. Well, that container might be perfect for growing, say, salad greens or even a tomato or two, but it might not be right for growing, if you don't have the space, a squash or a pumpkin. And so that's part of what you're looking at. Know your space so you can know what's best going to fit into that area. I've got a great example of how, when planned properly, this can work really well. We have 50-gallon food-safe drums that we've cut in half. Last season, we started off with radishes. We went from radishes into potatoes, red and white potatoes, and then after that we put some carrots in that bed. And so we got 3 crops in there. We got a spring crop with our radishes, we had a nice summer crop of potatoes, and then we followed that up with a fall crop of carrots. And so we were able to harvest from that single space, which is about 5 square feet, lots of vegetables overall. It was a fantastic set of harvests. That's a great example of what succession planting can look like. And we use vegetables that enable us to start early here in Zone 5 and grow the whole way up to the point where, well, basically the frost had happened and the ground was almost frozen. So if you have a specific growing space in mind, know which vegetables fit best there and then give it a try. Now, the fourth thing that you should know is something that I probably could have started with, but I wanted to focus on those vegetables first before I got to the point of the soil. The fourth thing you should know is know your soil. Whether we're talking about native soil or potting mix, the principle is still the same. You need to know what's in your soil. It pays to do a soil test, whether that's one of those kits that you buy, and I'll put a link to one in the description that we use, or you send it off, because a lot of times you can send off your soil to somewhere locally and they'll test it for you. Once you understand the NPK of your soil, then you'll know how to amend the soil, or even if there's any amending necessary. Now that's step one. It doesn't really make sense to go out and just throw fertilizer in your soil when you don't know the makeup of the soil. The end result of just fertilizing your soil without knowing what it already contains is that you could have way too much nitrogen, way too much phosphorus, etc. And that's not actually very healthy for your plants. An excess of nitrogen can have the exact opposite effect of what you want, which are nice green vegetables and fruits. So the secondary piece of this is, once you know your soil, then you need to know what nutrients your specific vegetables feed heavily on in the soil. If you're growing a lot of leafy greens, like your spinaches, for example, then you know that you're going to need more nitrogen in the soil because they're pretty heavy nitrogen feeders. If you're growing root crops, well, root crops feed heavily on phosphorus. And so what you need to do is make sure you're giving them the nutrients they need. So if you're planning to plant the same crop again back to back, then just remember that it's been feeding off of whatever it is that it likes. And so the next crop's going to want more of that, and so that's probably what you'll need to add to the soil in order to fertilize it to have it ready to go for that succession planting. Now the fifth thing you need to know, and I say this sincerely, you need to know yourself. Different vegetables take different amounts of care. If you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of time to tend to vegetables, then look for vegetables that require less maintenance, that are kind of lightweight. And I'll say this very clearly to you. Some vegetables are finicky, are picky. If they see a weed, they get choked out. There's a lot of problems that can happen if you don't know yourself and know your limits. What you have time for is what you should grow. So I'm going to suggest to you that you look for vegetables that are easy, that are hands-off, and you'll still find plenty that you can plant successively. Well, those are 5 things we think you need to know as you get started with succession planting. Now, before I end this video, I want to give you a couple of examples of succession planting that we've done in addition to the ones I mentioned in the video, because I think it's important to hear what's worked well for us. Again, we don't ever recommend any of these gardening methods unless we've had success ourselves. Last season in one of our 2x6 raised beds, so this is 12 square feet, we planted some giant noble spinach. That stuff was fantastic. Massive, deep green leaves. We harvested a whole bunch of that. Right after that, we planted some sweet potatoes, and right after those sweet potatoes were harvested, those were Hannah sweet potatoes, they were fantastic as well. I use that word a lot, but I'm telling you, they were delicious, and we're still eating off those Hannah sweet potatoes. Right after that, we planted some of our garlic that's then going to come up in the fall. So that's 3 crops in 12 square feet, and I will tell you, if I had to calculate the total weight, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60 pounds of food out of that bed, and that doesn't even count the garlic that's going to come up in the fall. In one of our other 2x6 raised beds, we started off with 5 different varieties of carrots. They were absolutely wonderful tasting. And we followed that up with eggplant and peppers in that same bed. And then we followed that up with broccoli and some kohlrabi. So we had, again, multiple different varieties, but 3 definite different successive crops there. In one of our other containers, we planted about a half a dozen garlic bulbs, and we were able to this fall go ahead and put some tomato plants in that same container. So while we were getting ready to harvest the garlic, we had tomatoes growing as well. It's not like each of our planting has to happen one right after the other. You can also grow sometimes one right on top of the other. And that goes to our green stalk vertical garden, where as soon as we had finished harvesting our red, white, and blue potatoes, we moved into some of our Swiss chard and some of our kale, so we had fall crops coming out there as well. Now that's just a couple examples of what we've done with succession planting, but I promise you this, if you get the timing down, if you know what you're doing, you are going to end up with some absolutely fantastic crops that take the course of your entire growing season and use it to the best benefit you can. And for those of us in these lower growing zones where we have a lot less time, that's all the more valuable of an experience for us in terms of growing our own food and our journey towards self-sufficiency. Well, we hope you enjoyed this video today and are encouraged to give succession planting a try. Don't just say, I've got one plant and that's all I need the whole season. Take advantage of the bookends. Take advantage of the whole growing season as best you can. Well, if you enjoyed this video today, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, when you're with us, you are good to grow.